Hello again. It's time for the conclusion of our three-part series on democracy, and we're going to talk a little bit about the problems and criticisms that have been made of democracy. Now, we undoubtedly live in a democratic era. At the beginning of this century, perhaps 15 or 20 countries in the world could have a claim to being representative democracies. Today, over 90 countries are democracies, so over half the countries in the world have some claim to democratic credentials. This shows the power and spread of an idea that at the beginning of the century was almost embarrassing, and at the end of the century became something almost normal and normatively ideal. Now, different theories of democracy, different justifications of democracy, face different kinds of criticism. Instrumentalist theories have faced criticisms about democratic performance. They tend to defend democracy to the extent that it produces good outcomes. And a lot of people are very worried at putting and this has been true ever since democracy became a word in ancient Greece, that people were having these worries. Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle all had their misgivings, deep misgivings, about their own democracies. But again, the idea is that giving the people the keys to the car, so to speak, is perhaps not the wisest of moves. On the other hand, non-instrumentalist views face different sorts of criticisms. This family of criticisms worries that the quest for democratic legitimacy undercuts some basic principles of justice. And so, again, this sort of view hurts the non-instrumentalist view. Let's talk about worries about democratic performance. How well do democracies really do at the end of the day? We could spend an entire semester talking about these sorts of issues, going over the evidence, critiquing the evidence, the way it was gathered, the sample sizes, and so on and so forth. I do that a little bit of that in my class on democratic theory, so I can't go into a whole lot of detail. But one big area of criticism is voter knowledge. Voters know very little about public policy. They tend not to be very well educated on matters of public concern. They tend not to know who their representatives are or what they stand for. They tend to not be very aware at all of what their representatives have done recently or in the more distant past in the legislature, what sorts of things they voted on, or whether those policy or what kinds of effects those policies are likely to have. So voter knowledge is low. Moreover, their incentive to acquire knowledge is low. That is to say that because a single vote is unlikely to make a large difference, and in any case the difference between the candidates, the difference in the consequences between the candidates will be spread over millions of voters in most cases, so the costs of becoming more informed are high, the benefits of becoming more informed are very low, and so at the end of the day the argument is that democracy faces a systematic problem of low information. Why is this a problem for democracy? Well, again, if the people as a whole are the ones to be making decisions, and if those people don't know whether those decisions are good or bad, or what their representatives are doing, how can they possibly punish them for bad behavior? How can they possibly steer the democratic ship, so to speak, in a better direction? At worst, the direction is going to be random. Or I'm sorry, at best, the direction is going to be random. At worst, political entrepreneurs and intelligent politicians are going to be able to take advantage of these sort of systematic pathologies among voters and are going to be able to direct them towards aims of their own rather than the aims shared by the voters. A second string of criticisms, perhaps even more biting than the criticisms that voters are ignorant, is that voters are in fact irrational. That is to say, when they get to the ballot box, they indulge in fanciful preferences. They indulge in beliefs that are wildly at odds with any perceivable reality. Why might that be? Well, again, the idea here is that, once again, the costs of expressing fanciful preference at the ballot box is very low. a lot of people have to have the same crazy belief as you for that belief to even matter at all. And if it does turn out to matter, you will share in the pain with many, many other voters. So again, if it makes you feel good to think that raising the minimum wage to $100 an hour would be or blockading China and Japan would be fantastic economic policies, then you might as well vote that way. And of course, if enough people want to vote that way, you're going to get politicians trying to cater to those sorts of beliefs. And at the end of the day, perhaps everyone will be worse off if those sorts of policies win out. So it's not that voters are poorly informed, it's that they actively enjoy indulging in irrational but comforting beliefs about the economy, about foreign policy, about the environment and global warming, about scientific matters like education. I'm sorry, like did I say global warming already? I forget. Scientific matters like evolution or just basic chemistry and biology. So it could be that voters are worse than ignorant. So, in sum, what these criticisms do is they undercut the notion that democracies are going to, at the end of the day, produce good outcomes. If voters don't know what their representatives are doing, if they don't know what would fix the problem, and they don't even respond rationally to political events, how can they be trusted to govern? Elections are supposed to hold representatives accountable and provide incentives for improvement. Remember John Stuart Mill. But it's not clear how more voters in modern democracies could possibly do that, given their level of knowledge and their attitudes towards politics when they get to the ballot box. So why would you think that majorities are particularly well qualified to rule? This is not necessarily a new criticism, although the tools and the evidence has gotten more sophisticated over time. Another set of criticisms doesn't focus on democratic performance, or perhaps doesn't only focus on democratic performance, but worries about the very ideal that democracy is setting up. Is democracy really the best way of showing our respect for individuals? Why think that giving people an equal say in a collective decision is more respectful than letting them make their own decision? Why think that a majority is particularly likely to respect a minority for that matter? This set of worries is related to questions about the proper relationship between public and private spheres. Democracy seems to be quite respectful when a collective decision absolutely must be made. So, for instance, we have to make a decision about how much to spend on defense. We have to make a decision on what quality air we're going to breathe, at least in public, in cities. But when a collective decision is optional, such as whether or not individuals should smoke marijuana or not, whether or not individuals need a license to practice a certain business, whether or not individuals ought to be allowed to immigrate or emigrate freely or not, it's not quite so clear that there needs to be a collective decision. These are things that individuals might be perfectly capable for deciding on their own without imposing too many costs on other people. And so, democracy on the one hand seems relatively unimpeachable over some range of issues, but there's a wide range of issues where it's just not so clear what counts as respecting individuals, their plans, their agency, and so on and so forth. A further worry that's related to this question about justice is called the boundary problem. The boundary problem is the problem that democracies have in defining their boundaries. For example, who gets to vote? Democracies say that over matters of common concern, everybody should get to vote. But who's this everybody? And over what set of issues do they get to vote? The boundedness of democracy seems inevitable, but by making democracy bounded, democracy becomes exclusionary. And this leads us to the insight that democracy is never going to be, and never has been, maximally inclusive. If you go back a couple thousand years to Athenian democracy, democracy was restricted to a fairly small set of citizens. Males of Athenian lineage, certainly not slaves, certainly not women, certainly not resident aliens, even some non-property owners were probably excluded. So, again, democracy has never meant that everybody gets to vote, and even today, not everybody gets to vote. Children and adolescents don't vote. The mentally incompetent or insane don't always get to vote. Criminals don't always get to vote, particularly felons. Foreigners in other countries who are affected by our decisions get no say whatsoever, and neither do foreign residents in the United States. They don't get a say over matters that presumably affect them and affect their communities and lives more generally. So, and I don't see a whole lot of people objecting to the state of affairs either, which goes to show that democracy is simply an idea that's limited in its applicability. It's the who gets to decide, right? The question of the demos, right? The people who get to decide is not something that you can settle by majority rule, because of course a majority implies that you've already settled the question of a majority of what. So, democracy can't tell you who should count as a citizen, and we know this because democracies don't always protect the interests of non-voters very well. When we look at the United States and its history, and particularly in Jim Crow South, for example, the fact that African Americans were long denied, or either explicitly denied, or it made it very difficult for them to express their votes at the ballot box, and as a result, their interests didn't seem to be protected very well under those circumstances. Of course, democracies go to war just about as often as other countries. Usually not with other democracies, but democracies have no problem going to war, which means imposing costs on other citizens, or I'm sorry, on non-citizens. Democracy, of course, can't also tell you when it's appropriate to have democracy. So, for instance, a lot of people talk about democracy in the workplace. Should workplaces be more democratic? I don't think democracy, the concept of democracy, can give you an answer here. You're going to have to look at other principles to decide whether it might be good for our workplaces to be governed more democratically. Same with the family. Obviously, many feminists and others have criticized the heavily patriarchal nature of particularly Southern European families, but also historically Northern European families as well, and noted that women have very little input into the decision-making process and children even less. Perhaps families should be run more democratically. What about in terms of international institutions at the United Nations and so on and so forth? People criticize the UN Security Council, the 5 countries who have basically veto policy on the UN, or veto power over United Nations General Assembly decisions, and they say, look, our international institutions are deeply undemocratic when you have 5 countries, any one of which whose veto will stop a General Assembly decision. Is it appropriate to have democracy between nations? I don't know. But again, democracy is not going to provide you the answer. We have to look to other principles that are going to tell us whether that would be fair or desirable. So the boundary problem isn't necessarily a problem for democracy per se, but it's more of an insight into the kinds of problems that democracy can and cannot solve. And noting that there's a whole range of problems that democracy by itself can't tell us the answer to. All right, that concludes our 3-part series on democracy and democratic theory. If you have any questions, as always, you know how to reach me.